Good morning, welcome, or good afternoon, actually just afternoon. Welcome to those of you that are starting to join us. We'll just give people a little bit of time to come in and join us today. So welcome to this Southwest Marine Ecosystems, oh, and I'm on the wrong slide, the Southwest Marine Ecosystems webinar today, being hosted here at the Marine Biological Association. My name's Kathy. I'm going to hang out in the background and hopefully make sure that things go smoothly. I'll hand you over to Keith shortly, who's going to give today's lecture. But before I do, just a few housekeeping bits and pieces. So if we're going to keep all the questions till the end, but if you'd like to ask a question, you've got two options today. So the first option is that you can click on the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, as my slide shows you. And in there, you can type your question. And then at the end, we'll be able to read those out and Keith can answer those live. So that's one option. But if you'd actually like to ask your question live, then when we get to that stage, you can click the raise your hand icon at the bottom of the screen. And I can unmute you and you'll be able to actually talk to Keith in real life. So either option is absolutely fine with us. If you'd like to speak with Keith in real life, you can do that. And then there's also the chat function. Please, if we can keep questions out of the chat, but you can obviously interact on there, let us know where you're from, where you're joining us from today, and add any comments to the chat. So without further ado, I shall pass over to our presenter for today, Dr. Keith Hiscock, who's going to talk to us about the seashore and seabeds. Over to you, Keith.
Okay, thank you, Kathy. Did you see that chat from Mike Poulston that he has no sound? I'm not sure what that's all about.
Okay, I shall pop in possible solutions to that into the chat for you.
Okay, right. Have you got my welcome slide?
We have indeed, Keith.
Right, there we are. We're off then. Good. Okay. Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. My name's Keith Hiscock from the Marine Biological Association, and for several years now, I've been collating the information on seashore and seabed observations for each particular annual report. What I would like to do to introduce this is actually to say where this information comes from. So much of the information in this presentation and that which will be included in the annual report is harvested from social media. There are lots of groups out there on Facebook in particular who specialize in particular groups or particular topics and post some really interesting observations. Of course, there are also fishermen, divers, members of the public who go rock pooling who also post. What I'd like is some more direct communications. You've got my email address there when you see something interesting, or if you've got a view on why something's happening or whatever. So I think that I'm picking up a lot of material off those social media platforms, but there'll be lots of things I miss. So do please get in touch with me. There we are. So what I'd like to do during this presentation is really to adopt more of a state of the Southwest Seas approach. So rather than going through phylum by phylum, topic by topic, I'd like to look at sightings, observations, which might tell us something about the state of Southwest Seas and how they're changing. That said, a great deal of the observations which I make, don't fit into single categories. All the time, my driving interest is one of curiosity, fascination, and trying to work out what might be causing change, and whether that change matters, whether it matters from the point of view of biodiversity conservation, whether it matters from the point of view of sustainable fisheries, whatever, and what do they tell us about the state of our seas? Trying to make links between weather, climate trends, it's sometimes very easy. Storms cause mass strandings, that's easy. Those are events. And sometimes very difficult, particularly with regard to long-term fluctuations such as the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation. So well, let's have a look at what sort of changes we're talking about and what they tell us about the state of Southwest Seas. And again, asking for your additional observations and interpretations. So that's a list of categories which I'll be using. Persistence. This is something I really want people who go to the seashore, who go diving, who go out dredging, grab sampling, whatever, to try and get their head round and to use the data and the literature which is available. So here we've got an example which I'll give of an unusual worm and seagrass at Marra Pool, which is at Baton Bay in Plymouth Sound. So here we are in 2021 with John Bishop from the MBA and Andy Mackey sampling worms and looking for a particularly unusual and very delicate worm in the sediment there. But that worm was described as new to science in 1904. It was found there in 1902. So Andy's going back to a site where this worm was found in 1902. But not just that, the scientific paper indicates that the location consists of patches of sand covered with Zostera, seagrass, Zostera marina. Well, lo and behold, the worm is still there. And so are the patches of Zostera marina, you know, a species which is much valued these days and which has seen a large decline. So there is persistence, and you can do that. You can go back to the 1850s to reports which are published by people like Philip Henry Goss, and you can go back and see if you can find the same species as they recorded, because they often recorded exactly the location, the rock pool that you can re-find. So persistence, are we seeing persistence in valued species, in abundance, in biodiversity? But of course, there will be declines and losses, and that's another topic. Is it anything to worry about? So if we're doing the state of the seas, are we losing anything which is valued and which is important for ecosystem structure and functioning? Now, I've noticed declines in the abundance of this well-known subtidal species, Ross coral, Pentapora foliacea. Now, this is a photograph I took in November last year. It's of a colony of Ross coral. It's a good foot across, it's a good 30 centimeters across. It's beginning to die back in the middle, which is what they often do. But places like XHMS Scylla, where they settled very quickly and grew quite quickly, most of the reef sites out of Plymouth, I'm just not seeing them in the same abundance these days. What's going on there? So I asked Kate Locke from the SWME Marine Protected Area, and they've actually seen an enormous increase in the amount of Ross, Pentapora foliacea. So the mysteries only grow, they're not necessarily being explained away. There's also been reported a decline in the abundance of small brown crabs on the shore at least. So just one or two observations, one or two impressions, if you like. What have you seen? Have you got any view as to whether the abundance of brown crabs, whether on the shore or whether from fisheries, is actually decreasing? Here's another one. This is particularly pertinent to my interest. This is a colony of sunset cup corals, Leptopsamia pravoti, at Lundy. Now, I found Leptopsamia for the first time in British waters at this precise location in September 1969. So obviously I'm taking a particular personal interest in the abundance of them. And the abundance of them, based on viewpoint photographs, is about 1/4 of what it was in the mid-1980s. This is a nationally rare species. It's a biodiversity action plan species. It's a species which Lundy is one of only about 5 locations where it's present in Great Britain. Now, some money was found by Natural England towards the end of last year, or rather late last year, to go back and take systematic quantitative photographs of the sunset cup corals at the Knollpin site at Lundy. Unfortunately, that money came through too late to organise a proper systematic survey, get a boat, etc., before the weather turned belly up. But within literally 2 days of that event being a possibility, I'd already booked to go out with Ilfracombe Dive Club to Lundy, and I, of course, persuaded them, thank you very much indeed, Ilfracombe Dive Club, to put me on the Knollpins, and took a series of viewpoint photographs, which I was able to paste together into a mosaic. Now, that's where I get the quarter of the numbers compared with the mid-1980s. But look at that picture. There are some tiny ones there. There are some ones there virtually the size of a pinhead. They're obviously recruiting, they're reproducing, and in fact have the numbers began to show a comeback. Let's wait and see this year. I'll say, before I say anything else, I'll say that the abundance of the really closely related scarlet and gold star corals, which are monitored every year since 1984, including by the wardens on Lundy, last year they showed a very significant increase in abundance. So a closely related species, which has been on the increase for the last few years. So who knows, perhaps the sunset cup corals will show an increase, but they really haven't been properly monitored as a nationally rare species in a marine protected area. They should have been. And we've got the Lundy Marine Festival coming up in 2022. There's the website where we hope that we can actually get some studies underway, some much more systematic resurveys to see not just the state of the sunset cup corals, but of sea anemones, corals, soft corals all around Lundy, which all seem to have been in decline since the mid-1980s. So let's hope for some more positive news next year. Increasing abundance and extent. Well, you all know this story because it's been going on since 2014. In 2014, after spiny lobsters had become locally extinct in certain parts of southwest Britain following overexploitation in the late 60s and early 70s, we started to see babies. And then we were seeing up to 20 in a dive in the coast out of Plymouth. But there are a lot less now being recorded by divers, the story is a muddled one. So although the depths to which divers go is being, the numbers are being reduced, the deep divers, the one who go down to wrecks in 60 meters, 70 meters, they're seeing a lot more spiny lobsters. And I've been suggested to me up to 20 in half an hour. There was even one seen in a rock pool at Wembury during a Marine Centre event in May. Now, there are various census surveys going on. Devon and Severn Inshore Fisheries and Conservation Authority have got fishermen reporting back from the Start Point area where there's a bylaw against taking spiny lobsters as to how many are coming up in ordinary lobster pots. The Cornwall Inshore Fisheries and Conservation Authority have got a programme going to identify how many, and I've got a quote from one of the fishermen who takes crawfish, who has caught and photographed one buried hen in Mounts Bay in early October. Now, it's very difficult to see the eggs because of the large platelets which the female holds over the eggs to protect them. You can just see some orange eggs sticking out from underneath those platelets. So a large female spiny lobster, one from about a couple of hundred, the only one from about a couple of hundred. So it's a continuing story. Sea search divers have done brilliantly in terms of documenting the rise of crawfish from where they were previously locally extinct. And Angus Jackson has now published a paper in the Journal of the Marine Biological Association describing that rise. And if you're into modeling and you're into formulae and you like that sort of thing, then do use that DOI to access Angus's paper. So a continuing saga, and one which still needs to keep on being interpreted. We're still seeing babies, they're still recruiting, so do send in your records. Another one where sea search also has been active has been in terms of seagrass, and people greatly value seagrass because of its ability to store carbon and because of the biodiversity which is associated with particularly Zostera marina. So two sorts of seagrass. One is intertidal, in fact, not just intertidal, but mid-tidal. So here you are looking at over the mudflats at St. John's Lake at the entrance to the Tamar to Zostera knowltii. And that's at Inniswork Point, near to Millbrook, and looking out towards the dockyard. And you can see this really sort of solid mat of seagrass. It reproduces at a different time of year. Seeds are there in October in particular. And there's a general agreement amongst local people and scientists that the extent has increased in both Plymouth Sound and in Salcombe Harbour, the Kingsbridge estuary. So Zostera knowltii seems to be doing very well. There's also an indication that Zostera marina, the one which particularly suffered in the 1930s from disease and which has declined greatly around our shores, has also been the subject of various studies. The Cornwall IFCA, together with Exeter University and part of Cornwall County Council's Nature Recovery Project, it seems that extents in the Fal and Helford have increased. And it also seems, because it's in Cornwall, the area around Cawsand in the Plymouth Sound and estuaries, especially our area of conservation, has increased. So thanks to Colin Trundle from the Cornwall IFCA for that information. Now, I went out on sea search surveys of a couple of seagrass beds. One of them was in Cawsand Bay. The other was in Leakbed Bay in Plymouth Sound. Now, I'm going to ask you a question. Leakbed and Leak Cove in Salcombe. Do you think, or do you know, that the old time boatmen, fishermen who put their anchor or their grappling hook over the side of their boat to anchor in a bay in Plymouth Sound and brought up seagrass, green leaves, white rhizomes, might have called them leeks? So anywhere with a name like Leakbed Bay, perhaps seagrass was always there. But my buddy is showing me a stalk jellyfish, which is one of the species which is part of the high biodiversity which occurs in the seagrass beds. And a little bit of a message here for those of you who survey seagrass beds. You know, it's all very well measuring their width, their extent, but remember the phrase, never mind the quality, feel the width. Never mind the quality, feel the width. Don't just feel the width, have a look at the quality. What sort of biodiversity are those seagrass beds supporting? Is it reducing? Is it getting greater? I think that's the sort of information we'd really like. And of course, seagrass has benefited from EU funding in terms of recovery programs. And here's a bit of text about the 4-year remedies project. And it's funded by EU Life Programme, led by Natural England, in partnership with the Marine Conservation Society Ocean Conservation Trust, based at the National Marine Aquarium, Plymouth City Council, and the Tamar Estuaries Consultative Forum, and the Royal Yachting Association. Sorry, you could have read that. So do have a look at, visit saveourseabed.co.uk, and there's a longer URL at the bottom there. So if I put my cursor to where I'm talking about, I know this is a nice view of Plymouth Sound during lockdown when we were all going for walks and so on. But about here is where Leakbed Bay is. That's where the existing seagrass bed is present. And then just over here is Lennycliff Bay, which is where a major seagrass restoration program, or perhaps creating a new seagrass bed, is based. And a couple of pictures from the Ocean Conservation Trust. One of the way in which Hessian bags with seagrass seeds in are being deployed on the seagrass as a way of trying to get the seagrass bed going. Typical sort of habitat, lots of feather duster worms, Sabella pavonina, and a sort of muddy, sandy seabed with bits of seaweed and so on. This is the sort of habitat in which you'd expect a seagrass bed to be present. And these Hessian bags have been used elsewhere in the world quite successfully. Not so successfully in West Wales, hardly any success at all. We're waiting to get back in the water, perhaps it's already happened, to see whether the bags which were put out in the 7th of April last year, from the 7th of April onwards, have actually produced some seedlings. But the Ocean Conservation Trust is working very hard at the National Marine Aquarium to work out the best conditions in which to establish culture regimes. And in the right-hand picture here, you can see a slightly different approach to getting seedlings. And you can see some seedlings here. These are actually coconut matting. This is coconut matting about 30 centimeters by 30 centimeters, obviously with some appropriate sediment, some muddy sand or some sandy mud. And then the whole issue is to do with what temperature, what salinity, what lighting do you need to get successful propagation of those seeds. So a lot to be learned, and let's see whether in fact the project is successful in establishing a seagrass bed. But certainly during last year there was a lot of activity, and there will be again this year. Increasing abundance and extent. So here's another category. In terms of assessing the state of our seas, are we getting certain valued species, or perhaps warmer water species, increasing in abundance and extent? Some of them might be recoveries as well. This is a good example of both. So this is a picture of St. Piran's crab, Clibinarius erythropus, which was, of course, given the same name St. Piran's crab because it was first found in 1960 in Cornwall. And so, of course, St. Piran was a hermit, just like the hermit crab, and which also has a sort of cross-shaped insignia on its eye. So St. Piran's crab, now known not just from Cornwall, but as far east on the South Devon coast as Thurleston, that's Steve Hawkins, and at Newquay on the Cornwall coast, from Newquay, as far east as Newquay. It's moderately abundant at locations from Mount Spey to Wembury, but it does seem to be increasing in abundance and extent, and it has been found, they have been found with eggs. So the idea is that they're probably larvae which came across from Brittany on a particularly strong, unusual current, which we know exists. These jet stream currents quite often can bring larvae across from Brittany for the species to settle in the southwest. But it seems as if there is local recruitment now, that the populations, including observations of what they call nurseries of St. Piran's crab in places like Hannaford Point at Looe, it does seem as if the populations might be self-recruiting of this warm water species. So a recovery and an increase in extent, and perhaps with luck, because they're a very interesting story and they're very pretty, the St. Piran's hermit crab is here for good. New species to the southwest. Well, of course, this is bound to be my favorite because I found it. So although Sabella spallanzanii, the Mediterranean feather duster worm, had already been recorded from Southampton Water by Teresa Derbyshire from the National Museum in Cardiff, and at Gosport Marina very nearby by John Bishop and Christine Wood from the MBA. I went and found it at Firestone Bay in Plymouth Sound. Just one, very different to the worm that we're used to, Bispira voluticornis, the fan worm. This one has a very nice spiral fan, which doesn't retract. I spent ages taking this photograph and taking other photographs, and it didn't take a bit of notice. It's also got a very vertical tube, which has got stuff growing on it. And I've found it since I found it literally about 5 days ago again. So it's still there, still in the same place, but I haven't found any more. So those of you who get out and about diving, do look, do take photographs, for goodness sake. I looked at the National Biodiversity Network and dug down through the records of Sabella spallanzanii, and almost all of them were not validated properly. They could not be trusted. If you see something peculiar like this, you might not know it's something unusual, but do take photographs. Do be ready to be interrogated about what you've called something, because unfortunately, a lot of the records which are slipping through the net are ones which are incorrect and not validated. So I think there's a message there to take care, take images, if it's appropriate, take samples and get them validated. So there will be new species popping up. The ones that in Southampton Water probably are reproducing locally. Again, jet stream currents, perhaps from Brittany, bringing larvae over to the Plymouth area. So are there any others? Are there any other species which are beginning to come into our waters, which might be warm water species, or it might be just be pure chance that the currents have brought them in? Episodic events. I mentioned earlier on that some things are easy to make a link between the environment and an event which has happened. And this is a picture, really dramatic, if you like, events like this, like washouts. And this is mid-February last year, near Dawlish. And last year saw a much greater incidence of easterly winds, and possibly because the winds came up from an unusual direction, not the usual sort of predominant southwesterly winds, but a lot higher abundance, if you like, of easterly winds. See the presentation by Tim Smythe for chapter and verse on the oceanographic conditions in 2021. So often it's deep burrowing species which get taken out by these peculiar winds and the consequent deep wave action which occurs. So you've got cockles there which are near the surface, but you've also got razorfish which dig very deep, about 50 centimeters down. There are other things as well. So we had some, you often find out species which you would never see if you were diving, or perhaps if you were doing a shallow dredge. Things like these siphunculids, which were also washed up. There were a lot of things washed up. There were dead wrasse washed up. And it's down to people from the Shores of South Devon group who did a really excellent job of going out and monitoring, or rather investigating, what species had been dug out of the deep seabed by these unusual storms in mid-February. Do take opportunities like that, whether it's an oil spill, hope for no more of those, or whether it's extreme storms, or whether it's some other event like a particularly hot summer or something like that, with things washing up dead. Then do document that, because it helps us to make those sorts of connections. It helps us to understand what is driving change. Here's a couple more. So you've got mantis shrimp. That was another deep burrowing species which was washed out at several places. Quite a lot washed out in Studland Bay, with dozens being stranded at a place called Little Beach. And this is an observation image by Barney Baker. And here's a rather unwell-looking common octopus. I suspect that it was already dead when the storms came in mid-February. So here we are at Towan Beach on the Roseland Peninsula in the Fowl in mid-February again. And we'd seen a lot of common octopus in 2018 and 2019, with a dead one being washed up in February 2020. What you need to do is your homework, because people will say common octopus, Mediterranean octopus. Well, that's climate change, isn't it? That's them coming into our country where they never used to be. Well, there was what was called a plague of common octopus in 1900. And again, they were very common in 1950. So perhaps it's more likely a perfect storm of good reproductive success, appropriate currents and so on, which are bringing common octopus northwards towards our shores in certain years. We need more records. Obviously, it's always a question of more data needed. But do look out for things like this, do report them, because again, it's making that connection, but it's also knowing about the scientific literature and being able to look back and say, actually, this has happened before, so expect it to happen again. So when we start to get every year with a lot of common octopus, that perhaps we can start to shout climate change, warming seas. Every year we get unusual sightings, things that pop up and we haven't seen for several years. And nudibranch sea slugs are notorious for this. They appear and they're quite exotic, and there are lots of people who love nudibranchs, and they make a speciality of recording them, identifying them. It's a lovely group to deal with because they're very colourful. They can be reasonably easily identified. The names flipping will keep changing with changes in taxonomy. So here's just a couple. There'll be a few more in the report, but that lovely one top left there, Ampharina farinae, south coast of Cornwall, and Catalina pelusta. I've seen a record of that species for 2022 as well, seen at Hilsea Point Rock. And so we're getting what we expect. We expect odd records of unusual species. We expect odd records of things like the barnacle conchoderma, which is something which settles on anything floating about in the ocean near the surface. And triggerfish are brought up by currents from places like the Azores and from the east coast of the United States to turn up in our waters, usually in about late June, early July. And then they hang around, and they're quite often in large numbers as well. And they are there until about November, December, when the seawater temperature drops below 12 degrees, and they start to be found washed up on the strand line. So they come here for their holidays, but they can't get home again. And that's happened. They've been found in British waters since at least the middle of the 19th century, the triggerfish, that is. But obviously sometimes they come ashore with one of these barnacles attached to them. The slipper lobster, first recorded in British waters in 1758. This is one which was caught off Land's End. Possibly every year there's a record of a slipper lobster being seen or caught. But it has been suggested that in recent years more have been turning up in lobster pots. So thanks to the Real Cornish Crab Company for making this image available. And I think that, again, are they getting more abundant? They are a warmer water species. So do keep your eyes open for them, do report them, do take photographs of them. I do wish more divers would take cameras with them underwater. Unusual sightings again. So a very pretty little shrimp, which comes from David Fennick, who makes the most marvelous observations and identifications on his seashore forages, but just a rarely seen shrimp. But my goodness, if you see that under boulder, you're going to be able to put a name to it quite easily, but you're also going to need to photograph it to prove that that's what you've seen. And this is very peculiar to me. Never seen this. A cluster of sea spiders reported by several people actually in early 2021. So this photograph by Paul Petit and Steve Trewella reports it as well. Huge clusters on the 23rd of March, 22nd and 23rd of March in Dorset. It's a nymphon species. Should have collected some, I suppose, to work out exactly which species. There were some which had eggs. Is it a reproductive gathering or what? So see if it happens again this year. Well, we've gone past the 22nd of March this year, and I haven't seen any reports, but do look out for this sort of very unusual sighting. It might tell us something about reproduction or some sort of convocation of sea spiders. More on increasing abundance and extent. This is going into non-native species. Of course, what we're most interested in is changes in native species, but we're also getting non-native species which have already arrived in our southwest peninsula. And this, of course, is one of them. Here at Beggars Island on the Tamar estuary, you can see the rail bridge in the background there, where Cornwall Wildlife Trust in particular have been monitoring changes in the abundance of these oysters, these Pacific oysters, and also range extensions. So now found in the Fleet Lagoon. Now, there's a lot of surveys which have been undertaken, those which were undertaken between 2017 and 2020. A report was published in 2021. So since this is the Southwest Marine Ecosystems Report for 2021, we'll advertise any new publications which have been produced in 2021. And this is one which tells the story, if you like, of the increase in Pacific oysters, in Cornwall in particular, but we're getting lots of records also from the River Yam and from other places like the Salcombe and Kingsbridge estuary. It's a real pest. It's dominated the shore. There are studies being done looking at the biodiversity associated with Pacific oysters. We also need to look out for native oysters. There's a British Sub-Aqua Club project at the moment, which I haven't put up a URL for, but it's a very worthy project looking for native oysters, getting divers to photograph and measure them wherever they find them. I don't find many. Half a dozen in one shore search would be a large number. So do join the look for native oysters, a species which again has suffered an enormous decline. And there are projects trying to reinstate native oysters. Non-native species recorded for the first time in Britain. Thank you very much indeed to John Bishop for these images of Bispira polyomma, something which is now well known from some of the enclosed areas in the Netherlands. A very pretty little tube worm, very blue fans. Here's a picture in a tray, present on marina pontoons. Obviously start looking out for it on natural substrata. So this is a non-native species recorded for the first time in Britain from Plymouth in October 2021. And I'm afraid that we'll probably keep on seeing ones, and there is, you know, a prediction of certain species which we might expect to turn up in British waters because they're already in France or the Netherlands or whatever. Who knows what's around the corner. Do keep your eyes open for anything which strikes you as unusual. Non-native species again, range extensions. This is Picea californica. The specific name tells you where it originates from. And during the Darwin Tree of Life project, which is looking at DNA in all species, they were at the MBA for a week. earlier in 2021, sorry, in end of August 2021, and collected samples of Pike californica from Bovisand Harbour and West Hoe in Plymouth Sound. Now, it was first collected in the Isles of Scilly in 1967, but it wasn't identified as such. And so I was a bit puzzled when I was told that the first record was allocated to me in 1983, because I don't do seaweeds. I think somebody else must have identified it, and it went into a report which I authored. So it wasn't actually properly identified until 1983. It's found on the mainland in 2015 when David Fennick reported it from Newlyn. It's been found in other places in Cornwall, but this is quite an extension eastwards along the coast to the Plymouth area. Mike Poulston from the Shores of South Devon Group reports that Wakami, which is a large kelp, Undaria pinnatifida, is spreading westwards around Torbay. Did I write westwards? Do I mean eastwards? I'm not sure. From the initial recording of it in Torquay Harbour. Also found eastwards to Meadfoot Beach. Appears to be increasing in abundance at sites year-round around Torbay. There are always sporelings and plants at any time of the year, but it is particularly at this time of year that you start to see it. The range extension of red ripple bryozoan, I was dismayed to find it at Lundy in May last year. Rosie Ellis, the warden on Lundy now, and I were exploring the shore to the north of Rat Island, looking for Pacific oysters, which have been found on Lundy in 2020, not actually finding any. I'm not aware of any records of Pacific oysters from Lundy in 2021, so let's hope that just a few managed to find their way to the island in 2020. But the red ripple bryozoan water sipona has found its way to Lundy now. And you can see Rosie looking at that colony, and then a little bit of a close-up of what it looks like, and you can see why it's called the red ripple bryozoan. Very easy to identify, seems to be very intertidal. Have your camera at the ready, take pictures so that your observation of possibly range extensions or whatever can be validated. So a couple of range extensions of non-native species. And here's another one. This is a pycnogonid, which previously was recorded from Brownsea Island and Pool in Dorset. So, well, both in Pool. And here it is on the slipway at Saltash in Cornwall. Another excellent observation, and also an excellent image by David Fennick. So what have we actually discovered? What have we found out? And also emboldened here is perhaps my conclusions, which might be called state of the seas inclusions. We're not there yet. We're deciding how to represent the observations which are being made through the year in terms of assessing the state of our seas. But it is something which we can do on an annual basis, not the sort of six-yearly cycle that is prevalent in many other government-funded assessments. So we can do it on a yearly basis. We just need to see how to represent it and how to make our observations more quantitative, more useful to those who have to regulate human activities and understand and separate what are normal events from those which might suggest some sort of problem. So my assessment is not very systematic, it's rather colloquial, and it's from the point of view of benthos. I'm only doing in this slide seashore and seabed. So sort of information that really needs a gathering of those people who make observations to see how to interpret things. My final comment will be very pointed. So I think from the point of view of the usual range of events such as washouts, strandings, small number of Northeast Atlantic species near to their distribution being found, nothing unusual for events, a normal year. There have been some continued increases in abundance of some valued species, so a slight improvement in seagrass extent. Currents of Northeast Atlantic species may suggest the effects of occasional strong currents bringing larvae across the channel, but also perhaps self-recruiting populations if conditions such as warming encourage such. There is no massive increase of warm water species that might suggest significant climate change effects. Challenge me on that if you like, with your evidence. Warming is having an effect, but I think it's benign. It's not affecting ecosystem functioning or markedly changing composition of biota. So a slight increase in warm water species. The number of non-native marine species in the southwest waters continues to grow, and the geographical range and sometimes abundance increases. Some adverse effects growing, particularly of Pacific oysters. So there's a negative assessment for the state of our seas with regard to non-native species. And I think that's going to be the case forevermore. So non-native species is one of the scoring factors for assessing good environmental status. And if you take away non-native species from that scoring assessment, I think you might find that everything's a bit steady as she goes. But again, criticize me with your evidence if you disagree. Some declines over the past 40 years may be reversing. For instance, anthozoans at Lundy, but uncertain for long-term fluctuations. And my final pointed comment, we need to do much better at systematically recording events and change, but we need a way to do that. We need a way that these sorts of narrative observations, these eclectic observations, these colloquial observations, how do we actually record that? I think that we can do it, and we can display that information, particularly using, for instance, the Marine Life Information Network website, the Marlin website, adding species to it, adding species habitats to it, and including other information which might inform decision makers about whether something is normal, whether it's been recorded before, perhaps even into the middle of the 19th century, or whether it's something which is unusual and something which might be the result of human activities or events. So that's the state of Southwest Seas, or rather the state of seashore and seabed ones. So do send me your additional observations for 2022, sorry, for 2021. So anything I haven't mentioned, do send the 2021 observations to me. Do send me your observations, your new observations as we go through 2022, and do let me know your interpretation of why those changes are happening. That's my email address. And with that, I'll say thank you very much. And I'll in a minute go back to Kathy.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Keith. So I suppose now is the time to see if anyone's got any questions, if anyone wants to raise their hand and speak to Keith, or pop your question in the Q&A. So there has been a few comments in the chat, Keith, which you may or may not want to have a little bit of a look at.
You can see me looking a bit closer to my screen.
I thought you might be just having a little look at those.
I can enlarge that. Oh, it's still very tiny. Sorry, the writing on my screen is still very tiny, so I'm looking a bit closer. Mike Poulston mentions a mild winter, largely intact Undaria. Undaria occurs in Plymouth Sound all the way through the year, Mike. You might get seedlings all the way through the year, but this is the time of year when, you should expect large, fresh-looking individuals, to collect your wakame, to wrap your sushi in, and so on. So I think that it's difficult to judge. I mean, I was in the water yesterday and I was seeing less in the way of wakame at West Hoe than I often see, but somewhere in Plymouth Sound there'll be masses of it. So I think it's a bit patchy in terms of different locations, having large amounts in different years. So Gratilupia turrituru, yes, that's the devil's tongue seaweed. It's quite distinctive, and it does look like a long bright red tongue. Keep an eye open for that. And I think it was 2020 that we recorded your observations of it. And I'm not looking at the top now. I somehow picked Mike's comment on. Now I'm just seeing things about settings.
So there's one from Adele and there's one from Constance, all below the messages that I've.
Oh, right. Okay.
There.
Yeah. Adele is finding more water sipona and wakame around the Fowl and the Helford. That's the sort of information we want, increased abundance. Yes, so I think that I think I've answered those. I don't know whether you can see any more, Kathy, but
so Constance has said, I see a lot of El Pavoti, excuse my pronunciation, when I dive in northern Brittany. Apologies if I missed this, but why the decline on the other side of the channel?
Okay. Right, so Lundy is at the northern limits of its distribution of the sunset cup corals distribution. So you'd expect anything at the northern limits of its distribution, a warm water species, you'd expect them to be struggling a bit. But off Plymouth, on the Plymouth Sound drop-off, the sunset cup coral populations are absolutely thriving. Very interesting. I mean, I've seen them in Brittany, and we've got another project which is stalled a long time ago, where I've actually got samples of sunset cup corals for DNA analysis from Brittany and from 4 locations in southwest England. And I'd love to get those samples analysed for their DNA to see if there are any regional variations, because it has a very short-lived larva. So the larva is spat out. I mean, I've had them in the aquarium at home, and the larva gets spat out from the adults and settles almost immediately. It might swim around for an hour or two. And when you see the colonies, you see a colony of 300, and then you go along a particular cliff face or whatever for another 100 meters with all sorts of suitable habitats, and you don't see any more until you see another group of 300, 400, 500. So they seem to actually self-recruit into the colonies where they occur. And I think at Lundy, it's a long-term variability linked to characteristics of the water column that we don't fully understand. But, you know, I've had to say this because I was asked pointedly by Chris Davis from English Nature, as was, you know, what do you think, Keith? And I think, well, I think it's part of a long-term fluctuation. We get these decadal scale fluctuations, and by decades, I mean sort of commonly over 40 years, you'll get something which declines in abundance and then suddenly pops back again. Well, I'm both hoping, and I have predicted, that that's the case with sunset cup corals at Lundy, but they're thriving at off Plymouth. I suspect they're thriving, they're thriving in places in the Isles of Scilly. I did re-photograph the monitoring site in the Isles of Scilly on a Porcupine Marine Naturalist Society field meeting about 8 years ago, and that had also declined by about 30% from the abundance which was there when we started the monitoring site going in the mid-1980s. So there are lots of monitoring sites out there which, under the tenure of the Nature Conservancy Council, we started going, continued for a short while under the tenure of English Nature, and then English Nature changed its priorities, and a lot of monitoring, a lot of very useful monitoring, stopped. Some of that monitoring we ought to pick up again, in my view. So, sorry, that was a rather overlong answer.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Keith. I don't see any other questions. There's nothing in the Q&A and nobody's raised their hand. So if you've got another question for Keith that you would like to ask, this is your opportunity. This is the time to do it. In the meantime, I'm just going to put a little bit of information in the chat. If you wanted to become a member of the MBA, then there's a link in there to our website. And also just a reminder that we're on social media at the MBA UK. So that's probably the best place to keep an eye for upcoming courses and stuff that's going on here that you can be involved with. So do follow us across all the platforms. We're even on TikTok these days, if that's your thing, at the MBA UK. So I'm not seeing any more questions, Keith, but thank you very much for your time. I'm sure everyone else will echo that as well. And clearly you've explained it all so well that nobody needs to ask any questions. So for the purposes of the recording, I'll just share a little bit of information about the MBA again. And without further ado, we'll end it there, Keith, unless you've got any final comments. I'm seeing a thumbs up. Brilliant. Excellent. Thank you very much, everybody, for attending this webinar. Lots of thanks coming through on the chat now, Keith. Lots of people thanking you for your time. So well done.